It was a sunny, peaceful morning. People went about their business, unaware that disaster was on its way.
Pearl Harbor was one of those things that you always dream about.
I had a little sweetheart on the beach, and I wanted to get over there kind of early.
Suddenly, death came roaring out of the sky.
All of a sudden, these planes started to come in at Hickam Field, which is to the right. And the firing started.
I thought it was the Navy just practicing until I got out and seen go whizzing by.
And I said, Forrest, what's going on out there? He said, I don't know, but all hell is busting loose.
In minutes, thousands were killed or wounded.
I said, there's our ships. I said, they're sinking. And I said, then look at Ford Island. Ford Island was one mass of fire and smoke. That's all you could see on the whole island.
And I was just hanging there, just with my arms onto the line. And I looked down, and if I dropped, I'd drop about 40 feet into a sea of oil, burning oil.
The lives of millions and the future of America were changed forever. It was 60 years ago. It was December 7th, 1941. It was Pearl Harbor. Hello, I'm Don Kerrigan. The place called Pearl Harbor has a profound meaning for Americans. Like Bunker Hill and Gettysburg and Normandy, it has become a permanent part of our national memory. And the events of December 7th, 1941, propelled the United States into the overwhelming event of the 20th century, the Second World War. For those who were there and lived through the ordeal, Pearl Harbor became a defining moment in their lives. In the next few minutes, you'll meet some Maine people who were there. And while time has healed most of their wounds, it has not dimmed their memories. For 60 years, they have all been remembering Pearl Harbor. 1941, the world was coming apart. War raged in the Atlantic and Pacific. Germany and Japan continued their march to domination of Europe and Asia. America was not at war, not yet. But Americans were all tuned in to what was happening in Europe, to Hitler's sweep across the continent, to the fall of France, and the gallant defense of London during the Blitz.
If we had kept together after the last war, if we had taken common measures for our safety, this renewal of the crest need never have fallen upon us.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted desperately to help the Allied nations. But the American people still hoped to avoid war. The country was still recovering from the Great Depression. And, after all, there was no direct threat to the U.S. mainland. So, in an effort to aid our Southeast Asian allies, Roosevelt cut off the shipment of oil and raw materials to Japan. Emperor Hirohito decided that was an act of war. His solution? Seize the oil-rich territories of the South Pacific. And all that stood in his way was the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet. So by the spring of 1941, the Japanese plan was in place. A surprise attack on the American fleet at its home base, Pearl Harbor, on the island of Oahu in Hawaii.
Pearl Harbor was one of those things that you always dream about, of being in an exotic island.
For young servicemen, pre-war Pearl Harbor was a paradise. Robert Baker was an electrician's mate on board the battleship West Virginia.
My brother and I, when he was on there, we used to play tennis every Sunday. We'd go over to the naval base courts and play tennis.
Pearl Harbor had been a refuge for the U.S. Navy for a century. Its nearly perfect anchorage offered protection for ships and a strategic location to reach across the Pacific. By 1940, Hawaii was a U.S. territory, and the Navy had transformed the harbor into a huge base. By December of '41, Pearl Harbor was filled with nearly 100 ships, submarines, destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, and the big guns, the 8 occupants of Battleship Row.
It was great duty. It was great duty for a youngster right out of college.
John Winkin was a young naval officer on board his first destroyer. For the star athlete and future coach, Hawaii was a playground.
Got to play golf, got to spend a lot of time at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. And there was a surf club there. And we used to play volleyball, and I learned to body surf.
Not everyone was happy to be in Hawaii. Frank Tremaine was a reporter for the United Press. Tremaine and his new bride, Kay, were assigned to Honolulu at a time when reporters wanted to cover the war in Europe.
It was a very pleasant assignment, but the war was going on in Europe, and I really would much preferred to have gone to Europe, but they asked me to go there to Honolulu, and it was a step along the route.
Much of the world was already at war, and U.S. involvement seemed likely. Bert Davis was an engineer on board the destroyer Selfridge.
The crew aboard the Selfridge was made up for the greater part of old Asiatic sailors, and they had lived out in the Orient all that time, and they all had stories to tell about the Japanese Navy and what it was doing out there. When Japan first started clashing their cymbals, why, they were the ones that said, we're going to have to get them one day.
But in 1941, people still imagined America could control when we went to war. And while there were coastal defenses in Maine and in Hawaii, most people felt safe on American soil.
I had an interview with General Short, who was the commander of the Hawaiian Department of the Army, in November. I asked him if the Japanese tried to invade Hawaii, could we defend ourselves? And he said, well, we might have some trouble in the outer islands, but Oahu, we could defend Oahu, which is where Honolulu and Pearl Harbor are located.
But late November brought new concerns of war. Negotiators in Washington struggled to reach a settlement with Japan. Quietly, some in the Pacific started to worry. Sergeant Irwin Crocker had transferred from the coastal artillery in Maine to work in the photo lab at Hickam Field, next to Pearl Harbor.
December 27th till December 5th, we were on an A1 alert. They posted the bulletin board, says that as soon as close to wartime footing as possible without alarming civilian populations. And I can see that just like your history.
And then on November 28th, all of a sudden, they assembled a task force which was made up of the carrier Enterprise and 3 cruisers and our squadron of 8 destroyers. We set out to sea, and the direction seemed to be towards the Philippines. As soon as we came out of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Halsey on November 28, 1941, sent a message to all ships, and this was the message: be prepared for war at all times. From that moment on, you sensed that something might happen.
And even as John Winkin and the task force cruised toward the South Pacific, a Japanese fleet with 6 aircraft carriers was bearing down on Hawaii from the north. Saturday, December 6th, the destroyer Selfridge was returning to Pearl Harbor. Her mission lasted longer than expected, and the Selfridge was low on fuel.
we had to mix the last of our lube oil and diesel oil together with our bunker oil in order to make port, because we didn't have enough fuel to get back in port. Well, we got over there just in time because we got our lines over and we had to haul the ship in by hand because we ran out of steam just as we got there.
Across the harbor on the battleship West Virginia, the crew got some good news.
One of the guys come down an electrical repair shop, and he had a newspaper from Honolulu. The headlines on that newspaper was, "Peace looms in Pacific." And this was about 12 hours before they was attacked. We were supposed to get underway on December the 6th at 6 o'clock. And about 5 minutes before we was to cast off, the word came through that we was to abandon sea detail because we was going to stay in port. Well, that made us pretty happy.
That Saturday night was a time to relax and play. There were parties and dances all around Pearl Harbor and Honolulu. It was a late night for many.
Kay was in an evening gown. I was in a white dinner jacket. The military were wearing their white mess jackets, all the ladies in formal gowns. It was a beautiful evening. George and I walked down 40, 50 yards from the lanai where the dinner and dancing was going on. Stood at the seawall looking out across the beach, just right near Waikiki, out to sea. It was peaceful, quiet.
Sunday morning dawned clear and sunny. Most on shore were sleeping late. On the 83 ships anchored in Pearl Harbor, it was a typical morning. December 7th promised to be a pleasant and uneventful day. But some 200 miles to the north, events were moving very fast indeed. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers turned into the wind and launched their planes. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and more. Their pilots had maps of the harbor, locations of the ships, all the details. They had carefully devised attack plans. They had more than 300 aircraft. They were about to rain destruction and death on the American Navy, and they had total surprise.
I was on the fantail shining my shoes, getting ready to go ashore. I had a little sweetheart on the beach and I wanted to get over there kind of early. While I was doing so, I saw these planes coming in. And the first thing I thought is, what the hell is the Army doing holding maneuvers on Sunday? I saw one of them come by and it dropped a torpedo, and I said, God almighty, that looks like a real thing. Then it turned up its wings, and I saw the big red spots on the wings, and of course I knew then it was Japanese.
So I was up in our living quarters where we ate, and I ate a late breakfast. And while I was eating breakfast, they said that called away the fire and rescue detail. Well, that was me. They said that there was a ship had blown up on the other side of the harbor, and they wanted us to go over and lend her assistance. So I went down below and grabbed my repair kit and headed for topside. And I went through the doorway into the hatchway out on the fantail. And about that time, I looked up and there was 2 planes flying over us. And I looked up and I could see the red meatball on the bottom of the wings.
We were supposed to be anchored on the night of December 6th, but we were held up by a real tough storm at sea, and so we were told not to come in. I remember relieving the watch at 7:45 in the morning. I took over as officer of the deck, and the carrier Enterprise was beginning to approach the entrance to the harbor. All of a sudden, these planes started to come in at Hickam Field, which was to the right. And the firing started, and the captain of our ship said, He got us to General Quarter Station. He said, "This is no drill."
I thought it was the Navy just practicing till I got out and seen go whizzing by, and with the rising sun on them, you know, damn well it wasn't the Navy. They were down low, but it wasn't like the Pearl Harbor movie showed it. They weren't between the ships, but they were down probably, I don't know, 300 feet or so like that. When you look out and you see 75 or 100 airplanes in the air all at once, in those days, that was something.
7:55 on Sunday morning, after being out late, I was pounding out to sleep, and I was awakened by booms, anti-aircraft fire. Really, it continued, and growing more intense. I thought I'd better go look out the window and see what I could see, which I did, and there were a lot of anti-aircraft puffs in the air in the direction of Pearl Harbor. I thought it was very unusual to be having an air raid drill on a Sunday morning, but we had a lot of them. But then, as it grew more intense, I went back and took another look. By this time, there was a plume of black smoke coming up.
It was not a drill. His reporter instinct kicked in, and Tremaine called his contacts at the military base.
And I said, "Forrest, what's going on out there?" He said, "I don't know, but all hell is busting loose. We're under attack." I said, "Well, who's attacking?" He said, "Well, we haven't identified them yet." At that point, I was not thinking of Japanese aircraft attacking Pearl Harbor. I said, "You don't think of the Germans, do you?"
When he came back and I heard what he was saying on the phone, then I was alerted, really, and I jumped out of bed and began stripping the bed. I thought, if we're going to be attacked, I better get everything clean before they poison our water supply.
Frank Tremaine, who once feared he would miss the war by being assigned to Hawaii, now filed the biggest story of his young career. He wired a message to United Press in San Francisco, New York, and Manila. It used just 6 words.
Flash, Pearl Harbor under aerial attack.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
But the White House had beaten Tremaine to the story. So he headed off to the attack, almost.
I didn't think pajamas were necessary in Hawaii, so I was doing this war coverage in the nude until Kay brought me a bathrobe.
Out in the harbor, all hell was breaking loose. Japanese airplanes dropped torpedoes and bombs on Battleship Row. Smoke and explosions filled the air. American anti-aircraft fire answered back, but had little effect. On shore, the Japanese planes strafed and bombed Hickam Field and other air bases. American planes were the targets here. The surprise was so total, the attack so effective, that most American aircraft were destroyed or disabled on the ground before they ever had a chance to fly. On the battleship West Virginia, Robert Baker and his crewmates were racing to save their ship.
I crawled up about 10 feet through a fresh air duct and dogged down a hatch in there. And while I was in there, there was a terrible lurch. The ship, just like it was jumping out of the water. I knew we got hit then. And the water was coming up in the compartment I was in, and I was in water probably up to my knees, and the rest of the crew was mostly down on the port side, close to the bulkhead. I tried to get them to come up where I was, and they couldn't because they had linoleum on the deck, and there was oil on it, and they couldn't stand up. And I kept hollering at them, "Swim, swim." That's the last I remember. Machinist mates in the next deck had to go through our compartment to get topside. Well, when they got over to the ladder to go topside, I was blown up against the ladder. They had to remove me to get up there, and consequently they found out I was still alive. I must have been unconscious, and I must have been far enough up on the ladder my head wasn't in the water. Otherwise, I would have drowned. I was the only one that got out of there alive, and there was 23 of us in there. The other 22 was all killed.
Baker's shipmates tied him to a bench and carried him topside. Baker was unconscious, but safe for the moment.
I saw the Raleigh starting to turn over, and then the Oklahoma started to go turn turtle.
On the destroyer Selfridge, Bert Davis watched death descend on Pearl Harbor.
And I ran up to the quarterdeck and I told the OD, I said, look at that. I said, there's our ships. I said, they're sinking. And I said, and look at Ford Island. Ford Island was one mass of fire and smoke. That's all you could see on the whole island. My God, there was flames higher than this house coming up there. That's the one thing that sticks in my mind. And seeing the ships turn turtle, seeing the two of them going over and turning turtle like that, and knowing that there were men in there. This is what bothered me more than anything else. There's guys in there, how in the hell are they going to get out, you know? Now, we couldn't go anywhere. We had no fuel. I could see these poor guys trying to swim through the water there, the fire that was burning there, and they're trying to swim in there, jumping off of the ships and everything that were sinking there on Ford Island. So I asked the OD, I says, how about me taking the whaleboat out here and see if I can help some of those guys? So there was another man and I jumped into the boat, and we went over there and we were picking up these people that are trying to swim through that water. My God, that was horrible. I reached down to get one guy, tried to pick him up. He's had his hand up like this, and I grabbed a hold and started to pull up, and he just like this, just skin came right off my hands. Time I got him into the beach, why, he was dead. A lot of them would be dead by the time we got him into the beach. They'd been breathing fire all that time, trying to get out of there. It was a matter of doing what we could in order to rectify the situation, whatever was going on, save this guy from drowning or whatever we were doing in the boat there, trying to get him over to get him some help on the beach. And then when you get there, find out that half your load is dead. That's what hurt. It hurt very much, but nothing we could do about it except go back and look for more.
Frank and Kay Tremaine had seen the opening of the attack from their hillside apartment. After wiring the alert back to United Press, Frank headed for the harbor.
I'd try to get to Pearl, and of course that was a very frustrating experience because people running around, cars, a lot of people, a lot of military and defense workers heading toward Pearl Harbor, brakes screeching.
Still at the apartment, Kay Tremaine was on the phone with United Press in San Francisco. While neighbors gathered on the front lawn, Kay gave the first eyewitness reports to the U.S. mainland.
I saw the ward limping back from what he'd seen that morning. The Japanese were dropping shells all around it. You'd see these splashes come up, but they didn't hit it, any of them.
But suddenly, the battle hit much closer to home.
While I was on the phone, I heard this whistling sound, which I'd seen in movies and things, but didn't think it was real. That siren sound, and it hit right in the side of the hill where our house was situated, about 50 yards from the house. But fortunately, the side of the hill absorbed it. And then I did probably the smartest thing I did all day. We had just bought up a naval officer's supply of booze. Civilians nobody could buy much booze except the service people. And we had bought this up, and nobody had any breakfast. And so I made up a big batch of eggnog, which gave us sustenance, and it had milk and egg in it, and added some of the booze to it. We all calmed down. We were calm the whole rest of the day.
We began to get awful hot. It brought me conscious. I found out that there was fire all around me, and I was tied down to this mess bench.
On the battleship West Virginia, Robert Baker was fighting for his life.
Just kept tugging at the knots and everything to get untied. But I was still about half unconscious when I was doing this. When I got loose, why, I started to go up on the forecastle deck because the fantail deck was beginning to flood because the ship was sinking. Well, I started up them decks, get up there, and I tried it twice and got knocked off. You know, they were so panicky, they just shoved me to one side because I wasn't but half unconscious. Finally, I made it. I was able to see a lot of things that was happening around me, things that you would never even would dream was happening. Bombs going off, ships being, you see, blowing up. And, well, it's just a lot of things. If you could just imagine what devastation would look like, that's what it was. The Arizona was in back of us. There was so much debris from the Arizona. A lot of it was blown over on the West Virginia and set it on fire. And it was set afire from stem to stern. And the fire burnt for about 30-some hours before they could get it out.
Within minutes, the West Virginia would suffer 9 crippling torpedo hits. The battleship was engulfed in flames and sinking. The order came, abandon ship.
Well, I looked over the sides, and every time I look over there, why, if I went overboard, why, I'd have to dive into oil that was all on fire all the way around me, around the ship. So I said, well, I'll scoot across on the hawser line over to the Tennessee. So I was still about half unconscious. I had a desire to live. I guess that's what you'd call it. But anyhow, I got across, up there on top of them hawser lines, and I was scooting my fanny, you know, backwards. And I got it right where there's a little bit of sag in the middle. And I got in there, and there was a concussion from something. I don't know what it was. It was a bomb that exploded close by. And it rocked me right off of it. And I was just hanging there, just with my arms onto the line. And I looked down, and if I dropped, I'd drop about 40 feet into a sea of oil, burning oil. And I could see my life just go in front of me. I was losing my strength and my consciousness fast, and I could see I wasn't going to make it. And there was a crew on the Tennessee was egging me on. Come on, you're going to make it. Come on, you're going to make it. And I had a web belt on, and some guy went out on the lines and grabbed my web belt about the time I went unconscious. And he held on to me and dragged me aboard the Tennessee. And when I got aboard the Tennessee, why, they hauled me down to the sick bay, and I was down there probably for the rest of the attack.
At Hickam Field and the other air bases, damage was severe. Irwin Crocker was scared.
Damn scared. Anyone sitting scared as an idiot. Christ, you don't know, you're going to get the next one, get you, what's going on? You have no place to go. Well, in the barracks, they're bombing the barracks.
As the first wave of attackers flew off, Crocker grabbed his camera and headed for the photo lab.
Well, I was taking pictures. I ran into Dudley, the sergeant, in the photo lab with him, and he hollered, "Here they come." Well, I thought he meant to strafe us again, but he'd seen the sun shine off of bombs, apparently. They dropped them, and we run like hell, get inside the barracks, 500-pounder through the roof, knocked me, probably me at the wall right at the corner, and I come to, and this staff sergeant is standing in the doorway, he's smoking a cigarette. And he turned around to him, he said, "Sergeant, you better get that man to the hospital." And hell, he was bleeding more than I was. But you walk across the field to the hospital, those palm trees don't stop many bullets. And you get on the porch there at Hickam, had mattresses there, guys laying on the mattresses, all wounded, arms off, legs off, dead, dying. Well, I don't know, I put 4 months in the hospital of it. Had that worst one there, and a piece went in here and out the back of my neck, and that finger busted ricochet bullet. Piece in there, stopped on my wristwatch. What scared me most, the chaplain come along, he said, "What are you, Catholic or Protestant, son?" I said, "Peter, here I come." I guess
Less than 2 hours after the first shots were fired, the attack was over.
As I drove back to Honolulu from Hickam, now 11:30, 12 o'clock, everything drove through downtown, and everything was surprisingly quiet. When I got back to the Bureau, shortly before noon, we sat down and tried to figure out just what happened, what had happened, what the damage was, and the various information we collected indicated that been very heavy damage to the fleet and very heavy damage to aircraft at the various air bases.
The damage was immense. All the battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. 19 ships in all, close to 200 airplanes damaged or destroyed, more than 1,200 service people wounded, more than 3,000 sailors, soldiers, and Marines missing or dead. John Winkin, on board the destroyer McCall, sailed into Pearl Harbor at night, only 12 hours after the attack.
Oh boy. Just to see the smoke and the fire burning, you know, of all of those battleships, and that was a devastating sight. That was terrifying. And you knew there were a lot of people whose lives were gone. It was an eerie, frightening, and devastating thing to see.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. United States of
The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt went to Congress. There, he spoke the words that had become so familiar, words that set the United States on a course that would forever change the nation and the world.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
America was at war. The next day, Germany and Italy joined their ally Japan and declared war on the U.S. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was executed perfectly. Surprise was total, and the attackers had virtually a free hand to bomb at will. But their plan was flawed. They succeeded in crippling U.S. battleships, but the Japanese planes neglected the huge oil storage facilities on shore.
If they had gone over there and blown up the oil fields that we took oil from aboard these ships, we'd been out there without any fuel for those ships. They realized, the Japanese realized, that was one of the blunders they made.
And they were unable to attack a single American aircraft carrier. By luck, all the carriers were at sea. Had the carriers or the oil been lost, the U.S. Navy might have taken far longer to recover, and the Pacific War might have been very different.
It seemed to me that Pearl Harbor was a chosen opportunity to, I suppose, devastate us, and I guess the Japanese figured by crippling our battleships, they were really crippling us, and yet I felt they could have crippled us beyond that point. We would have had a difficult time recovering from that.
And it seems the Japanese did not anticipate the force of an angry America. For months, Japanese diplomats in Washington had been carrying on negotiations with the U.S., even while the secret attack was being planned. And the Japanese ambassador had scheduled a meeting with Secretary of State Hull for December 7th, at the same time Japanese planes were dropping bombs on Pearl Harbor.
The sneak attack by the Japs really caused a binding in this country of young people and old people that I've never seen to this day.
Galen Cole was a sophomore at Bangor High School.
First thing Monday morning, we were called into the Bangor high school auditorium, the entire class, and the principal told us what it meant. We heard President Roosevelt speaking to Congress on the radio, and our lives were never the same again. We knew this was going to be a long war, and that we, in all likelihood, were going to be in it.
Paul Wilbur was in the same high school class.
Well, it was just disbelief, that's all. They just couldn't believe what had happened. We was at war. I mean, we were at war all of a sudden. I mean, the United States was involved in a war, and whether we wanted to or not.
Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry as Americans joined forces to fight the war. Cole and hundreds of others in the school began training for the service in ROTC.
There were maybe 500 ROTC students. We paraded and marched and did exercises up at Broadway Park, and we were getting prepared for war.
Cole would go into the Army immediately after graduation in 1944 and fight in Europe. Paul Wilbur wasn't willing to wait that long. He quit school and joined the Marines.
I didn't want to wait to be drafted. I didn't want to wait to finish high school. I wanted to get into it right off. So I spoke to my father about it, my mother. She said, well, you aren't old enough yet, son. And I said, well, I will be. January 30th of 1942, I turned 17. On February 12th of 1942, I was sworn in.
But at the time, few Americans actually knew the extent of damage or loss of life at Pearl Harbor. The military imposed a news blackout. No news in or out of Hawaii for 3 days.
Our competitors, AP and INS, never got any reports from the rest of the world for the next 3.5 days.
Even when the blackout was lifted, reporters faced tight restrictions on what they could see and say.
It was very frustrating, and of course, there was no official information given out. And when we finally were permitted to send stories on Wednesday, 3 days later, they were heavily censored.
It wasn't until a week later that Tremaine got a close-up view of the damage as he was taken on a boat tour of Pearl Harbor.
It was kind of a shattering experience to see how badly the fleet had been mauled. The California and the Mississippi and the West Virginia, all the outboard ships were heavily damaged and resting on the bottom. You could see bomb holes, torpedo holes. The Japanese torpedo planes were very effective. Evidence of fires, heavy fires.
The wounded learned of the damage in their own ways.
While I was in the hospital, a couple of days later, I got up and started walking around. And I looked out the window, and there was a tennis court. My oldest brother and I used to play tennis on every Sunday. Right in the middle of it was a Japanese plane that had got shot down and crashed right there in the middle of our tennis court.
Robert Baker went back to sea with a Purple Heart. Erwin Crocker got one too, after 4 months in the hospital.
If you live in the country, you got to be willing to fight for it. You want the benefits, but you can't fight for it when you get out.
There was little time to think about the past. The country was at war. In the Pacific, the U.S. fought back. There were some very dark moments for the American forces, including the fall of the Philippines. But slowly, we began to gain the upper hand. A series of crucial naval battles badly damaged the Japanese fleet. And then the Army and Marines began fighting across a series of islands, stepping stones toward the Japanese homeland. It was a terrible, frightening, and deadly business.
There wasn't one day of action in 56 months of action in the war that I wasn't scared or worried about getting through the day. I think we were one of 5 out of 289 destroyers later in the war that weren't damaged by a suicide plane. Now imagine those odds. Unbelievable, those kamikaze things. I remember one time I'm keeping station on a ship. It was a cruiser, and I'd walk to the other side and come back. Boom, gone.
The cruiser was gone?
Right down the middle of it. You know, bang. That was terrifying. That, to me, was the worst part of the war, the suicide plane.
Realistically, besides Pearl Harbor, besides the Coral Sea Battle and the Midway Battle, we was in 23 battles. They called them contact with the enemy. When the invasion of the Philippines was happening, why, we was up in Lingayen Gulf. Pretty soon at night had come, and we was stationed about halfway up the straits. And we was to intercept any ship that got by the initial first line fire. And pretty soon we could see a big ship was firing on the other side of an island. I could see the flames from the guns firing and hear them. I asked anyone, I says, can anyone on the line tell me what battleship's doing all the firing? And they said, yes, it's the West Virginia. That was the first time that she had gotten any action since December the 7th. She was sunk in Pearl Harbor. So there it was, the old West Virginia, over there firing and knocking those ships right out of the water as soon as they come through the straits.
When we made the beachhead on Bougainville, the ship stayed off there for 3 days and 3 nights, and those big guns never stopped. 72 hours, day and night, those guns went. You would have thought there couldn't be anything on that island still living. Now, when we hit Bougainville, the boat I was in, the one on either side of me, was blown out of the water. I was made it ashore. The minute we hit the beach and they dropped the front of those boats and we started toward the jungles, Japanese planes come in and started strafing the beach. You hit the ground, of course, and the bullets spattering all around you. And as soon as they go by, you jump up and you keep going, if you haven't been hit. It's a scary thing. It's a scary thing.
The Japanese were pushed back to their home islands. The American forces were preparing to invade when the decision was made to use the atom bomb. In September of 1945, after 3.5 years of war, it was over.
The surrender of the Japanese on the Missouri was the most impressive, moving ceremony that I've ever witnessed or been a part of.
Frank Tremaine, who saw the war start, also got to see it end on board the battleship Missouri for the surrender.
I was seated on a 16-inch gun turret right over the veranda deck where the ceremony took place, maybe 20 feet above it. See the officers assembled. Of course, the ship is full of seamen and Marines all hanging from every vantage point. The Japanese delegation coming aboard. MacArthur made another very brief speech in which he said that science had made weapons that should never be used in war again. There should be no more war.
And my destroyer, the Cowell, USS Cowell, was anchored not too far away. I could look through binoculars on the bridge of my destroyer. I could look through and see the ceremony on the Missouri.
The Japanese turn away carrying their copy of the surrender with them. And off in the distance to the south, there's a roar, and it gets louder and louder, and an echelon 9 B-29 Superforts, and then more and more. And then other planes, Hellcats and Wildcats and Mustangs and dive bombers and torpedo bombers, 1,000 planes more or less flying overhead, and they fly up the bay and over Tokyo, and that is when the ceremony really was over.
That was a thrilling moment. It was nice to know we finally made it.
They had survived, but they would forever carry with them the scars of war and of Pearl Harbor.
People expected war to take place, but on a more honorable basis, not a sneak attack. We would have been as much opposed to America had we sneak attacked Japan, declare war and go to war. That sneak attack by Japan has lived with our generation for a lifetime.
The memory of that surprise attack led to one of the country's scars from World War II, the internment of thousands of innocent Japanese Americans.
I'm sorry to say that, but I mistrusted the government. I did, because I thought that they had held information back from us that we should have had. They knew what was going to happen. And I think that they deliberately let it go on there so they'd have a good reason to go to war.
I must say, from my perspective, that the war, the breakout of the war, did not totally surprise me. You just had a feeling, particularly after getting that message from Halsey, and he having our task force constantly on the alert. I mean, from November 28th on, we were ready. I mean, we were alerted to the point where if anything was happening, we were going to be ready. We weren't going to get caught short. At least our task force wasn't. So somebody knew something.
But whether the attack could have been stopped or earlier warning given, it now seems inevitable that the United States was destined to enter the war and to emerge from it as a superpower, a role we have not relinquished. Pearl Harbor became engraved on the national memory, a permanent image of heroism, destruction, and death, and the pain of having been caught by surprise. The nation promised it would never happen again. Why is it important for people to remember Pearl Harbor?
Mainly so that it won't happen again.
Do you think it could happen again?
Yes, I think it could happen again. And it makes me worry about who's the next one in line. I don't know who it'll be or where or anything else, and I hope I don't even live to see it, but I'm afraid it might happen again.
60 years later, America suffered a new day of infamy. The September 11th attack on New York and Washington was even deadlier than the Pearl Harbor attack. But the surprise, the shock, the way the terrorist attack both stunned and united the country, these things were all eerie reminders of what happened that Sunday morning so many years ago.
Second Pearl Harbor, only worse. Imagine 6,000 people in those two buildings. Gives you goose pimples.
There are certain parallels. A sneak attack, totally unexpected, but then there are so many differences. At Pearl Harbor, all of the casualties were military, whereas the victims of the September 11 tragedy are 99.5% civilian.
It was an act of war, yes, but it was an act of war by whom?
Who specifically is the enemy, and how can we attack him?
When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, we knew exactly what had happened. The Japanese Empire attacked the United States. There was no question. I mean, we knew what it was, we knew who done it, and we knew what had to be done. But on September 11th, you didn't know where to go. Who do you blame? I mean, what nation is involved?
People in the United States and the rest of the world had really, they had used their imaginations to think about what happened at Pearl Harbor. On September 11, the whole world was looking at pictures of it as it did happen.
Today, a new generation of Americans faces an uncertain and frightening new world. They are uniting in the face of a threat that has suddenly hit very close to home.
My guess would be that this act of terrorism and the things that may follow will leave a greater scar on the people of the world than Pearl Harbor did.
Americans have a way of rallying when their lives are on the line.
And they are learning, again, to be prepared. It is, again, a painful lesson. A lesson first taught 60 years ago at Pearl Harbor.
Dad had taken a long weekend off, and he and Mother had gone up in the mountains so Dad could go fishing. And they were up there in the mountains. And they came back Monday afternoon. And they came back by, there was this little note on the door that says, "I'm well." And Dad says, "What the hell that's all about?" And they didn't know about it until they went in, and then they got the paper out. They had all the papers stacked up where they had been gone. And they got it out, and they read the paper about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and here's this note from me telling them I'm all right.
When I went to see the movie Pearl Harbor, I was so touched by these high school kids, boys. They'd come up to me and want to touch me, and shake my hand. And that generation